recently found this teeny tiny version of a book box at the Goodwill bins for $2 a pound. I'll teach you a new technique for chipped paint while I transform it into a library. The cover of this fake book was coming off, so I'm helping it along by removing it the rest of the way. I'm prepping the inside of the book by removing things that'll get in the way. I removed the satin front because I'll be cutting a hole in the cover. I technically could have left all of this stuff inside of the book because you can't really see it in the end, but thinking ahead is not really my forte. I'm using this window for my Bentley House Minis fireplace room box kit to create a template on some contact paper. This window is a bit smaller than I'd like, so I modified it a bit by making it wider. I'll mostly be cutting this with a knife, but I'm starting by drilling each of the corners so it's easier to cut out. This will hopefully prevent me from overcutting and cutting onto the sides of the book. The front of this book is made from multiple layers of pressed paper, kind of like layers of cereal box. I realized my blade was very dull, but carried on because I have no idea where my new blades are because my room is a bit chaotic since I just moved. I cut across each of the sides and along the bottom and started to peel it off. I used my X-Acto knife to make a shallow cut around the arched portion so I can just pull this off in layers. It was about 4 layers to get to the center of this window, and now I'm ready to clean up the inside of the box. I softened up some remaining bits of velvet using some water and scraped it out with my dull blade. As I said, this was completely unnecessary because you don't really end up seeing any of this, but since it was wet anyway, it gave me a good idea, so it was all worth it. I'd like the inside of this box to look abandoned, so I added some watered down glue. I recently created some really nice texture on a foam miniature fire pit, so I'm replicating the technique by adding toilet paper to the inside of the box. You'd probably have a hard time trying to apply this toilet paper in a smooth manner. I'm creating extra texture by letting it bubble in the middle and pressing it down from multiple directions. The toilet paper can easily tear at this stage, so I'm intentionally creating tear marks by moving my brush back and forth over the damp paper. I covered the back and 3 of the sides aside from the floor, which you won't see. Once it dried, I removed the excess paper using some sandpaper. The edges look a bit raggedy, but that'll be covered up by the front. I'm mixing some celery paint with white to paint the inside. This is chalk paint mixed with some acrylic. I'm choosing to paint this a light color so there's a nice contrast from the books and shelves that'll be in the foreground. I'll call this color lead paint green and say it's a lot more interesting than white. To accentuate all that delicious toilet paper texture, I'm mixing some dark wax from Waverly with water. I usually apply this product full strength as a stain on wood, but it works really well as a wash. I'm covering the entire inside of the box. You could layer this up in certain areas for more depth and color. I'm making a faux stained glass window using some trash plastic for the front of the box. I traced the shape of the window and flipped the plastic over so I don't accidentally sand away my marker. I'm using a fine grit piece of sandpaper to scuff up the surface. I did a couple test pieces to figure out that sanding the plastic and coating it with matte Mod Podge was a good way to get the color to stick. To begin my stained glass design, I'm drawing a line on the inside of the arched window. I googled stained glass arched window to find inspiration pieces. I couldn't find a window to trace outright, but I did find this smaller bit I can add to the center of my design. I'm using rubber finger protectors to keep myself from touching the screen and making the image move. I used a really thin mechanical pencil to trace the design. In the past, I've exclusively used markers to color faux stained glass, but I really like the subtlety of using colored pencils. Sanding the glass and adding the matte sealer created a bit of tooth for the pencil to stick to. Most of this faux glass will be missing, so I'm only adding color around the edges. I'm disguising and blending the pencil strokes using a white colored pencil. For contrast, I used a Sharpie to color in some of the red. This plastic is pretty substantial, so I'm using some dikes to cut out the design. I'm cutting through the edge so I don't have to meticulously cut out the center because nobody will care or notice that this little bit is nipped. I didn't even know what I was putting inside yet before I made this decision, but I decided to cut away some of the stained glass so the inside will show more. I'm protecting the color using some dimensional magic from Mod Podge. You could also use Diamond Glaze, which would have a very similar effect. You may remember from my Spider-Man project, but I added some dimensional magic to trash plastic to create texture. I'm doing the same thing here using a little bristly brush and a pouncing motion. When it dries, it creates this nice orange peel texture. Now that the whole thing's coated in dimensional magic, I'm adding some of the faux lead lines using a marker. This really makes the design pop and creates a lot of contrast. I'm using some cereal box to make faux wood trim to go around my window. The theme of this project seems to be avoiding cutting out the middle, so I'm just cutting straight through the edge with scissors so it's a lot easier and less tedious. This outer window will be glued together in layers, so I can very easily disguise this cut mark, and it's a lot faster than using an X-Acto knife. I cut a second skinnier layer with the cut mark on the opposite side so they don't line up. Layering the pieces like this makes a nice faux wooden trim look. I'm unifying the two pieces of cereal box by sanding and then adding a layer of wood glue. Rather than trying to get a smooth appearance with wood glue like I do when I'm trying to emulate porcelain, I'm dragging the brush back and forth through the glue as it dries to create some texture. The two layers of cereal box are pretty thin and out of scale for wooden trim, so I'm adding some adhesive backed foam. This foam adds a lot of thickness quickly, and it's really easy to cut. Again, rather than cutting out the middle, I cut through the side. I stuck the foam frame to the underside and painted the whole thing brown. I'm trying out a chipped paint technique, so I added a bit of blue paint and covered it with hairspray. I'm painting over the entire frame with acrylic paint called unbleached titanium, which is just an off-white color. I could have just used white because I covered the entire thing with some watered down dark wax. The dark wax adds a layer of grime to make it look like this window has been aging in the elements for decades. I created the stained glass with overhang, so now I can cut it to fit just inside of the frame. I glued the frame to the plastic using Beacon 3-in-1, which is an acetone-based glue that's similar to Fabri-Tac. To create the chipped and aged paint effect, I'm using the dull side of my X-Acto knife to scrape away some of the paint. The hairspray I added acts as a barrier and makes it easier for the paint to come off. I eventually realized using the sharp part of the blade was faster and didn't cause any damage. This hairspray technique really imitates the look of chipped paint rather than sanding through the layers of paint, which tends to look more rustic to me. I have some commitment issues, but I did manage to glue the window to the front of the book box using more 3-in-1. We'll be moving this party inside now, so I'm starting out by softening some wide popsicle sticks in warm water. I looked up some reference images for my abandoned library and saw that sometimes the shelves become waterlogged and sag under the weight of the books. I'm mimicking that look by adding a slight curve to this damp popsicle stick. I'm only going for a slight bend, so I bent it with my fingers and left it to dry. If you're going for a more aggressive curve, you would have to hold it with an elastic band or something. I placed the bit of cereal box I cut out from the center in the middle so I can keep track of where the focal point will be inside of this box. This helps me figure out the placement of my shelves among all of the broken stained glass. As little Gretchen would call it, I did a dry fit, try fit to see where the shelves should be placed. I like the size and placement, so now I'm staining the pieces. I'm using some more watered down Waverly dark wax to stain the pieces. I learned about this product from Tiny Keyhole Minis and have been playing around with using it. Before I was applying it full strength and wiping away the excess, but I do prefer the look of the watered down wax. I added a fourth curved shelf at the bottom. I'm using this bit of spine from a Uline catalog and some other books to fill the shelves. I've been hoarding this Webster's Dictionary for quite a while, but I think it'll take a place of prominence finally in this project. I want the library to look old, so I won't be using any modern books like this. I chose these little beauties, and the rest of the books I use will be plain. These are really cheap mass-produced books. They're looking far too new and perfect, so I'm sanding the edges using some sandpaper in my table. I'm wiping away the color in between books so I don't fill my sanded edges with a bunch of strange colors. I have some empty book covers left over from when I made clay books. This Bilbo book is pretty cool, but the pages inside are way too small, so I'm stealing those to add to my empty book covers. I made two skinny little books. I'll fill the now empty Bilbo book cover using some of this spine from a Uline catalog. Since the pages are nicely glued together, all I need to do is cut them into the size and shape of a miniature book. Cutting through this many layers with an X-Acto knife is a real pain in the ass, so I like to use this little X-Acto saw. This book is too thick as it is, so I'm just tearing off a piece from the glued spine. I wish I could say this is the first time I made this mistake, but it's not. When trimming your pages, it's best to hold them with a clip so they don't fly everywhere. At the end of the video, I'll link my video showing how to make magazines and books. I used a combination of wood glue and hot glue to attach the books. I'm brushing all of the books with some watered down brown paint to subdue the colors and kill some of the contrast. Some of the bottom shelf won't be visible at all, so I added some of the magazine catalog covered with blue painter's tape and just a piece of plain catalog. I'm making it look even more abandoned by adding some moss. I'm mostly using the dead brown looking stuff, but I added a bit of the green as well for a pop of color. It can be easy to overdo a fun step like this, so I was pretty restrained on the inside and added just a taste to the exterior. Consider joining my Patreon either as a free member or as a paying member for $3 a month. Watch this video next to learn how to make books and magazines using catalogs and other stuff you have lying around.